This is where I think Coates's work comes in a really important way and does another interesting kind of philosophical work for us. Coates, in his long form essay, Between the World and Me, shows how someone can kind of live through this progression away from a biological notion of race towards a kind of social political understanding of race and racism. So here's Coates talking to Ezra Klein, right? He did a really great interview. I linked to it on the Moodle page. He's talking about his work as a writer. He says, my objective as a writer is not merely to write in such a way that people read it and say, yeah, I think that's correct, is to write in such a way that people are haunted, that they go to bed thinking about it, that they wake up thinking about it, that they tell their spouses about it, that they tell their children about it and their friends about it. And they, grab them by the arm and say, you have to read this. You can't just deliver the ideas and expect people to be able to live with those ideas. You have to actually show them how someone can live with them. And that's one way, I think, to read Coates's beautiful book, Between the World and Me. He's showing us how to live with a kind of social political conception of race. So Coates was very influenced by Baldwin, and he makes this explicit. When he tells the story about writing this book, he says, "Oh, I called my editor and I said, how come nobody writes like James Baldwin anymore?" And he kind of set out to write something in the kind of in the tradition that Baldwin so profoundly represents. And so you see this in some of the language that he uses. For example, he uses the expression of people who believe that they are white, right? He says, what I'm concerned with are people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. And he means the same thing that Baldwin means. There are no white people, that the idea of whiteness is a kind of racial fraud that was carried out in order to subjugate other peoples. Race was invented for the purpose of subjugation. One of the interesting things that Coates writes, again, in this sort of Baldwin-esque vein, is that white America is a syndicate arrayed to protect its exclusive power to dominate and control Black bodies. And the police administer that power on Coates's reading. So that's another really important aspect of this essay, I think, that we could explore, is how he really unpacks the relationship between the police and the overarching syndicate of power that is white America. He agrees with Baldwin that there's really no such thing as white or Black people in a biological sense. However, right, he recognizes that he and Baldwin are Black. And so there's that interesting paradoxical terrain that I think he does a wonderful job exploring, right? There are no such thing as Black people from a kind of natural scientific standpoint, but there are Black people, and he and Baldwin are Black. And you need to kind of find a new sense, a new way of living that concept that isn't a biological one. And in an interesting way, he organizes his own journey around this passage from Saul Bellow. So Saul Bellow is a famous American novelist who reportedly said the following: "Who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, the Proust of the Papuans? I'd be glad to read him." And so what you see here is a kind of arrogant dismissal of the literary and cultural productions of other cultures, where Bellow is just saying, and this is in the 1980s, when there's this sort of push in American universities towards multiculturalism and having a syllabus that isn't just dominated by white authors. And Bellow's pushing back and he's saying, well, who's the Tolstoy of the Zulus? Who's the Proust of the Papuans? So it's very dismissive, very arrogant, and pretty racist. What Coates finds in this passage, right, what he feels strongly is that what this suggests is that serious history is the West and that the West is white. And so he thought, right, when he was educating himself at Howard University, he thought what was required was a new story, a new history, a search for the Tolstoy of the Zulus, a kind of weaponized cultural history. And that's what Coates set out to do when he was a young man at university. He wanted to find the Tolstoy of the Zulus, right, as a kind of reaction to what Bellow had said. But he pretty soon became disappointed with this quest. And he says part of what helped sort of thwart this quest for him were his history professors at Howard University, right? So they were questioning him about his kind of Pan-African view of what it meant to be Black. And so this is a kind of conversation between Coates's history professors and Coates. So his professors would say, did Black skin really convey nobility? Always? Coates would say, yes. And then they would respond, what about the Blacks who practiced slavery for millennia and sold slaves across the Sahara and then across the sea? Would those be the same Black kings who birthed all civilization? And what did I mean by Black? Well, you know, Black. Did I think this is a timeless category stretching into the deep past? Yes. Could it be supposed that simply because color was important to me, it had always been so? And so these sort of challenges started to awaken in Coates this sense that a biological notion of race, which he himself was dealing with at this point, was inadequate in various ways. And he also, right, studied the history of other populations who had been subjugated and who had been sort of treated as Black, right? So he read about the persecution of the Irish, for example, by the English. And he said, well, perhaps Black was just someone's name for being at the bottom. A human turned into an object turned into a pariah. Reading further on page 74 from Between the World and Me, he says, there was nothing holy or particular in my skin. I was Black because of history and heritage. There was no inherent meaning in Black blood. Black blood wasn't Black. Black skin wasn't even Black. Here you can see he's moving away from a biological conception of race towards a social political one. The race that you belong to is a function of heritage and history and subjugation rather than anything biological. He had a real wake-up call when he read this passage from Ralph Wiley responding to the quip by Bellow. So Bellow said, you know, show me the Tolstoy of the Zulus. And Ralph Wiley responds, Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, unless you find a profit in fencing off universal properties of mankind into exclusive tribal ownership. So this is a really important moment in the book because I think it really puts pressure on this discourse about Coates, right? So some people have criticized Coates and authors like Baldwin for engaging in identity politics. They say, oh, well, they just encourage Black people to just think of themselves as purely Black and not to think of themselves as like part of the wider humanity. And that just simply isn't true. Coates is putting this quotation in a very prominent place in the book and as key to his own transition in his thinking about what it means to be Black really shows that that is just completely off-base criticism of his work, right? Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus means that Tolstoy belongs to the Zulus just as much as Tolstoy belongs to the Russians, just as much as Tolstoy belongs to the European literary tradition, because we share a common humanity. And you can't just fence off universal properties of humankind into exclusive tribal ownership. So there is a universalism and a cosmopolitanism in the writing of Coates, and he's not simply fostering a kind of identity politics in his work. And so this was a moment in his own thinking where he had this key realization, and he says, my great error was not that I had accepted someone else's dream, but that I had accepted the fact of dreams, the need for escape, and the invention of racecraft. So he hadn't accepted the way Bellow was presenting whites as superior. He went to go and look for Blacks who were equivalent to Tolstoy, right? But in doing that, he was accepting the premise that racecraft was legitimate and that dreams in general were legitimate. He was engaging in creating his own dream that would stand side by side with the kind of white supremacist dream. And so this is a kind of crucial point where he rejects that idea altogether. But he says, and still in all, I knew that we were something, that we were a tribe on one hand invented and on the other no less real. And so he says, so by this point, I knew that I wasn't so much bound to a biological race, but to a group of people. And these people were not Black because of any uniform color or uniform physical feature. They were bound because they suffered under the weight of the dream. And they were bound by all the beautiful things, all the language and mannerisms, all the food and music, literature and philosophy, all the common language that they fashioned like diamonds under the weight of the dream. And he kind of sums up the point here they made us into a race. So racism and the subjugation of a particular population of people made them into a race. We made ourselves into a people, right? So under the pressure of the dream, under the pressure of subjugation, the group of people who were subjugated through their own free striving generated all of this sort of cultural bounty. And it's in that cultural bounty that Coates understands what it means to be Black. To be Black is to be a participant in that tradition, right? So it's a kind of positive reappropriation of what it means to belong to a subjugated group. I think that that is a fantastic result of this essay. Is he sort of starts us with a character himself who is in this position of understanding his membership in a race in rather biological terms, and he's resisting the narrative that a white race is dominant, but he's taken on a kind of dream of his own, right, by understanding, you know, his people in these biological terms. And then once he realizes that that isn't true, he learns how to live without a concept of race, without a biological concept of race, but an understanding of what it means to be Black in terms of Black cultural production and heritage. And I think it's just a really beautiful piece of writing. And if you haven't read it, I couldn't recommend it more.